The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Sir Oliver Sacks. 2. The Lost Mariner. After writing and publishing this history, I embarked with Dr. Elchanan Koldenberg, a pupil of Flora and editor of the original Russian edition of the Neuropsychology of Memory, on a close and systematic neuropsychological study of his patient. Dr. Goldberg has presented some of the preliminary findings at our conferences, and we hope in due course to publish a full count. A deeply moving and extraordinary film about a patient with a profound amnesia, prisoner of consciousness, made by Dr. Jonathan Miller, has just been shown in England, September 1986. A film has also been made by Hilary Lawson with the prosopagnosia patient, with many similarities to Dr. B. Such films are crucial to assess the imagination. What cannot be shown cannot be said. You have to begin to lose your memory, if only in bits and pieces, to realize that memory is what makes our lives. Life without memory is no life at all. Our memory is our coherence, our reason, our feeling, even our action. Without it, we are nothing. I can only wait for the final amnesia, the one that can erase an entire life, as it did to my mother's. Louis Bonnel. This moving and frightening segment in Bonnel's recently translated memoirs raises fundamental questions: clinical, practical, existential, physiological, philosophical. What sort of life, if any, what sort of world, what sort of a self can be preserved in a man who has lost the greater part of the memory, and with this his past and his mooring in time? It immediately made me think of a patient of mine in whom these questions are precisely exemplified. Charming, intelligent, memoryless Jimmy G, who was admitted to our home for the aged near New York City early 1975, with a cryptic transfer note saying, "Helpless, demented, confused, and disoriented." Jimmy was a fine-looking man with a curly bush of gray hair, a healthy and handsome 49-year-old. He was cheerful, friendly, and warm. "Hey, Doc," he said. "Nice morning. Do I take this chair here?" He was a genial soul, very ready to talk and to answer any questions I asked him. He told me his name and birth date, and the name of the little town in Connecticut where he was born. He described it in an affectionate detail, even drew me a map. He spoke of the houses where his family had lived. He remembered his phone number still. He spoke of school and school days, the friends he'd had, and his special fondness of mathematics and science. He talked with enthusiasm of his days in the Navy. He was 17, had just graduated from high school when he was drafted in 1943. With his good engineering mind, he was a natural for radio and electronics, and after a crash course in Texas, found himself assistant radio operator on submarine. He remembered the name of various submarines on which he had served, their missions, where they were stationed, the names of his shipmates. He remembered Morse code and was still fluent in Morse typing and touch typing. A full and interesting early life, remembered vividly, in detail, with affection. But there, for some reason, his reminiscence stopped. He recalled and almost relived his war days and service, the end of the war, and his thoughts for the future. He had come to love the Navy, thought he might stay in it. But with the GI Bill and support, he felt he might do best to go to college. His older brother was in accountancy school and engaged to a girl, real beauty, from Oregon. Was recalling, relieving Jimmy was full of animation. He didn't seem to be speaking of the past, but of the present, and I was very struck by the change of tense in his recollections as he passed from his school days to his days in the Navy. He had been using the past tense, but now used the present, and it seemed to me not just the formal or fictitious present tense of recall, but the actual present tense of immediate experience. A sudden, improbable suspension seized me. "What year is it, Mr. G?" I asked, concealing my perplexity under a casual manner. 45, man, what do you mean?" he went on. "We have won the war. FDR is dead. Truman's at the helm. There are great times ahead." "And you, Jamie, how old would you be?" Oddly, uncertainly, he hesitated a moment, as if engaged in a calculation. "Why, I guess I'm 19, Doc. I will be 20 next birthday." Looking at the gray-haired man before me, I had an impulse for which I have never forgiven myself. It was, or would have been, the height of cruelty, had there been any possibility of Jimmy's remembering it. "Here," I said, and thrust a mirror towards him. "Look in the mirror and tell me what you see." "Is that a 19-year-old looking out from the mirror?" He suddenly turned a shin and gripped the side of the chair. "Jesus Christ!" he whispered. "Christ, what's going on? What's happened to me? Is this a nightmare? Am I crazy? Is this a joke?" And he became frantic, panicked. "It's okay, Jamie," I said soothingly. "It's just a mistake. Nothing to worry about." Hey, I took him to the window. "Isn't this a lovely spring day? See the kids? They're playing baseball." He regained his color and started to laugh, and I stole away, taking the hateful mirror with me. 2 minutes later, I re-entered the room. Jimmy was still standing by the window, gazing with pleasure at the kids playing baseball below. He wheeled around as I opened the door, and his face assumed a cheery expression. "Hey, Doc," he said. "Nice morning. You wanted to talk to me? Do I take this chair here?" There was no sign of recognition of his frank, open face. "Haven't we met before, Mr. G?" I asked casually. No, I can't say we have. Quite a beer you got there. I wouldn't forget you, Doc." "Why do you call me Doc?" "Well, you are Doc, ain't you?" "Yes, but if you haven't met me, how do you know what I am?" "You talk like a doc. I can see you're a doc." Well, you're right. I am. I'm a neurologist here." "Neurologist? Hey, there's something wrong with my nerves." "And here? Where's here? What is this place, anyhow?" "I was just going to ask you, where do you think you are?" "I see these beds and these patients everywhere. It looks like a sort of a hospital to me. But hell, what would I be doing in a hospital and with all these old people years older than me? I feel good. I'm strong as a bull. Maybe I work here. Do I work? What's my job?" "No, you're shaking your head. I see in your eyes I don't work here. If I don't work here, I've been put here. Am I a patient? Am I sick? And don't know it, Doc? It's crazy. It's scary. Is this some sort of a joke?" "You don't know what the matter is? You really don't know. You remember telling me about your childhood, growing up in Connecticut, working as radio operator on submarines, and how your brother is engaged to a girl from Oregon?" "Hey, you're right. But I didn't tell you that. I never met you before in my life. You must have read all about it in my chart." "Okay," I said, "I will tell you a story. A man went to his doctor complaining of memory lapses. The doctor asked him some routine questions and then said, 'These lapses, what about them?' 'What lapses?' the patient replied. 'So that's my problem?' Jamie laughed. I kind of thought it was. I do find myself forgetting things once in a while, things that have just happened. The best is clear, though. Will you allow me to examine you? To run over some tests? Sure, he said genially. Oh, whatever you want. On intelligence testing, he showed excellent ability. He was quick-witted, observant, and logical, and had no difficulty solving complex problems and puzzles. No difficulty, that is, if they could be done quickly. If much time was required, he forgot what he was doing. He was quick and good at tic-tac-toe and checkers, and cunning and aggressive. He easily beat me, but he got lost at chess. The moves were too slow. Homing in on his memory, I found an extraordinary loss of recent memory, so that whatever was said or shown to him was apt to be forgiven in few seconds' time. Thus I laid out my watch, my tie, and my glasses on the desk, covered them, and asked him to remember these. Then after a minute's chat, I asked him what I had put under the cover. He remembered none of them, or indeed that I have even asked him to remember. I repeated the test, this time getting him to write down the names of 3 objects. Again he forgot, and when I showed him the paper with his writing on it, he was astonished, and said he had no recollection of writing anything down, though he acknowledged that it was his own writing, and then got a faint echo of the fact that he had written them down. He sometimes retained faint memories, some dim echo or sense of familiarity. Thus 5 minutes after I had played tic-tac-toe with him, he recollected that some doctor had played this with him a while back. Whether the while back was minutes or months ago, he had no idea. He then paused and said, "It could have been you." When I said it was me, he seemed amused. This faint amusement and indifference were very characteristics, as were the involved cogitation to which he was driven by being so disoriented and lost in time. When I asked Jimmy the time of the year, he would immediately look around for some clue. I was careful to remove the calendar from my desk, and would work out the time of the year roughly by looking through the window. It was not apparently that he failed to register in memory, but the memory traces were fugitive in the extreme, and were apt to be effaced within a minute. It wasn't apparently he failed to register in memory, but that the memory traces were fugitive in the extreme, and were apt to be effaced within a minute, often less, especially if there were distracting or competing stimuli. While his intellectual and perceptual powers were preserved and highly superior, Jimmy's scientific knowledge was that of a bright high school graduate with a penchant for mathematics and science. He was superb at arithmetical and also algebraic calculations, but only if they could be done with lightning speed. If there was many steps, too much time involved, he would forget where he was, and even the question. He knew the elements, compared them, and drew their periodic table, but omitted the transuranic elements. "Is this complete?" I asked when he'd finished. "It's complete and up-to-date, sir, as far as I know." "You wouldn't know any elements beyond uranium." "You kidding? There is 92 elements and uranium the last." I paused and flipped through a National Geographic on the table. "Tell me the planets," I said, "and something about them." Unhesitatingly, confidently, he gave me the planets, their names, their discovery, their distance from the sun, their estimated mass, character, and gravity. "What is this?" I asked, showing him a photo in the magazine I was holding. "It's the moon," he replied. "No, it's not," I answered. "It's a picture of Earth taken from the moon." "Doc, you're kidding. Someone would have to get a camera up there." "Naturally." "Hell, you're kidding. How the hell would you do that?" "Unless he was a commenced actor, a fraud simulating an astonishing he did not feel. This was an utterly convincing demonstration that he was still in the past. His words, his feeling, his innocent wonder, his struggle to make sense of what he saw were precisely those of an intelligent young man in the 40s faced with future. Was what he hadn't yet happened, and what was scarcely imaginable. This more than anything else, I wrote in my notes, persuades me that his cut off around 1945 is genuine. What I showed him and told him produced the authentic amazement which it would have done in an intelligent young man in the pre-Sputnik era. I found another photo in the magazine and pushed it over to him. "That's an aircraft carrier," he said. "Real ultra-modern design. I never saw one quite like that." "What's it called?" I asked. He glanced down, looked baffled, and said, "It's nimetazole." "Something the matter?" "The hell there is," he replied haughtily. "I know 'em all by name, and I don't know a Nimitz. Of course there is an Admiral Nimitz, but I never heard they named a carrier after him." Angrily he threw the magazine down. He was becoming fatigued, and somewhat irritable and anxious. Under the continuing pressure of anomaly and contradiction, and their fearful implication, to which he couldn't be entirely oblivious, I had already unthinkably pushed him into panic, and felt it was time to end our session. We wandered over the window again, and looked down at the sunlit baseball diamond, and he looked his face relaxed. He forgot the Nimitz, the satellite photo, the other horrors and hints, and became absorbed in the game below. Then, as a savory smell drifted up from the dining room, he smacked his lip, said "Lunch?" smiled, and took his leave. And I myself was wrung with emotion. It was heartbreaking, it was absurd, it was deeply perplexing, to think of his life he lost in limbo, dissolving. He is, as it were, I wrote in my notes, isolated in a single moment of being, with a mode or lacuna of forgetting all round him. He is a man without a past or future, struck in continuously changing, meaningless moment. And then, more brusquely, the reminder of the neurological examination is entirely normal impression, probably Korsakov syndrome, due to alcoholic degeneration of the mammillary body. My note was a strange mixture of facts and observations, carefully noted and itemized, with irrepressible mediations on what such problems might mean in regard to who and what and where this poor man was, whether indeed one could speak of an existence, could so absolute a privation of memory or continuity. I kept wondering, in this and later notes, unscientifically, about a lost soul, and how one might establish some continuity, some roots, for he was a man without roots, or rooted only in the remote past. Only connect, but how could he connect? And how could we help him to connect? What was life without connection? I might venture to affirm, Human wrote, that we are nothing but a bundle of collection of different sensations which succeed each other in an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. In some sense, he had been reduced to a human being. I cannot help thinking how fascinated Hume would have been at seeing in Jimmy his own philosophical chimera and crate, a gruesome reduction of a man to mere discontent, incoherent flux and change. Perhaps I could find advice or help in the medical literature, a literature which for some reason was largely Russian from Korsakov's original thesis in 1887 about such cases of memory lost, which are still called Korsakov syndrome, to Laura's neuropsychology of memory, which appeared in translation only a year after I saw Jimmy. Korsakov wrote in 1887, "Memory of recent events is distributed almost exclusively. Recent impressions apparently disappear soonest, whereas impressions of long go are recalled properly, so that the patient's ingenuity, his sharpness of wit, and his resourcefulness remain largely unaffected. To Korsakov, brilliant but spare observation, almost a century of further research has been added to richest and deepest. By far being Laura's, and in Laura's account, science became poetry, and a passage of radical lostness was evoked. Gross disturbance of the organization of impression of events and their sequence in time can always be observed in such patients, he wrote. In consequence, they lose their integral experience of time and begin to live in a world of isolated impressions. Further, as Laura noted, the eradication of impressions and their disorder might spread backward in time, in the most serious cases, even to relatively distant events. Most of Laura's patients, as described in this book, had massive and serious cerebral tumors, which had the same effect as Korsakoff syndrome, but later spread and were often fatal. Laura's included no cases of simple Korsakoff syndrome, but on the self-limiting destruction that Korsakov described, neuron destruction produced by alcohol in the tiny but crucial mammary body, the rest of the brain being perfectly preserved. And so, there was no long-term follow-up of Laura's cases. I had at first been deeply puzzled and dubious, even suspicious, about the apparently sharp cut-off in 1945, a date which was also symbolically so sharp. I wrote in subsequent note, "There is a great blank. We don't know what happened then, or subsequently. We must fill in the missing years, from his brother, or the Navy, or hospitals he has been in. Could it be that he sustained some massive trauma at this time, some massive cerebral or emotional trauma in combat, in the war, and that this may have affected him ever since? Was the war his high point, the last time he was really alive? An existence since one long anticlimax? Is his fascinating oral history the good war?" Studs, Turkle transcribes countless stories of men and women, especially fighting men, who felt World War II was intensely real, by far the most real and significant time of their lives, everything since as ballad in comparison. Such men tend to dwell on the war and to relieve its battles, comradeship, moral certainties, and intensity. But this dwelling on the past and relative aptitude towards the present, his emotional dwelling of current feeling and memory, is nothing like Jamie's organic amnesia. I recently had occasion to discuss the question with Strelick. "I have met thousands of men," he told me, "who feel they have been marking time since 45, but I never met anyone for whom time terminated like amnesic Jamie." We did various tests on him, EEG, brain scans, and found no evidence of massive brain damage, although atrophy of the tiny mammary body would not show up on such tests. We reserved reports from the Navy, including that he had remained in the Navy until 1965 and that he was perfectly competent at the time. Then we turned up a short nasty report from Bluff Hospital dated 1971, saying that he was totally disoriented with an advanced organic brain syndrome due to alcohol. Cirrhosis had also developed by this time. From Belleville, he was sent to a rich dump in the village, and so-called nursing home, whence he was rescued, lousy, starving, by our home in 1975. We located his brother, whom Jimmy also spoke of as being in a county school and engaged to a girl from Oregon. In fact, he had married the girl from Oregon, had become a father and grandfather, and had been practicing accountant for 30 years. Where we had hoped for an abundance of information and feeling from his brother, we received a courteous but somewhat meagre letter It was obvious from reading this, especially reading between the lines, that the brothers had scarcely seen each other since 1943 and gone separate ways, partly through the fastidious application and profession, and partly through deep, though not estranging, differences of temperament. Jimmy, it seemed, had never settled down, was happy to go, and always a drinker. The Navy, his brother felt, provided a structure, a life, and the real problems started when he left it. In 1965, without his habitual structure and anchor, Jimmy had ceased to work, gone to pieces, and started to drink heavily. There had been some memory impairment of the Korsakov type in the middle and especially in the late 60s, but not so severe that Jimmy couldn't cope in his nonchalant fashion. But his drinking grew heavier in 1970. Around the Christmas of the year, his brother understood he had suddenly blown his top and become deliriously excited and confused, and it was at this point he had taken it into Belleville. During the next month, the excitement and delirium died down, but he was left with deep and bizarre memory lapses or deficiencies, to use the medical jargon. His brother had visited him at this time. They hadn't met for 20 years, and to his horror, Jimmy not only failed to recognize him, but said, "Stop joking, you're old enough to be my father. My brother's a young man just going through accountancy school." When I received this information, I was more perplexed still. Why did Jimmy not remember his later years in the Navy? Why did he not recall and organize his memories until 1970? I hadn't heard then that such patients might have retrograde amnesia. I wonder increasingly. I wrote at this time whether there is not an element of hysterical or fugal amnesia, whether he is not in flight from something too awful to recall, and I suggested he had been seen by our psychiatrist. Her report was searching and detailed. The examination had included a sodium aluminate test calculated to release any memories which might be repressed. She also attempted to hypnotize Jimmy in the hope of eliciting memories repressed by hysteria. This tends to work well in cases of hysterical amnesia, but it failed because Jimmy could not be hypnotized, not because of any resistance, but because of his extreme amnesia, which caused him to lose track of what the hypnotist was saying. Dr. M. Homonoff, who worked on amnesia ward on Boston Veteran Administration Hospital, tells me of similar experiences and of his feelings that this is absolutely characteristic of patients of Korsakov's, as opposed to patients with hysterical amnesia. I have no feeling or evidence, the psychiatrist wrote, of any hysterical or motive deficit. He lacks both the means and the motive to make a facet. His memory deficits are organic and permanent and incorrigible, though it's puzzling they should go back so long, since she felt he was unconcerned, manifested no special anxiety, constituted no management problems. There was nothing she could offer or any psychiatric entrance or lever she could see. At this point, persuaded that this was indeed pure Korsakov, uncomplicated by other factors, emotional or organic, I wrote to Laura and asked his opinion. He spoke in his reply of this patient, Bell, whose amnesia had retroactively eradicated 10 years. He said he saw no reason why such retrograde amnesia shouldn't thrust backwards decades or almost a whole lifetime. I could only wait for the final amnesia. Beora writes, the one that can erase an entire life. But Jimmy's amnesia, for whatever reason, had erased memory and time back to 1945, roughly, and then stopped. Occasionally, he would recall something much later, but the recall was fragmentary and dislocated in time. Once, seeing the word satellite in a newspaper headline, he said offendedly that he had been involved in a project of satellite tracking while on the ship Chavasquay Bay, a memory fragment coming from the early or mid-60s. But for all practical purposes, his cutoff point was during the mid or late 40s, and anything subsequently retrieved was fragmentary, unconnected. His was the case in 1975, and it's still the case now, 9 years later. What could we do? What should we do? There are no prescriptions, Laura wrote. In a case like this, do whatever ingenuity and your heart suggest. There is little or no hope of any recovery in this memory, but a man doesn't consist of memory alone. He has feeling, well, sensibilities, moral being, matters of which neuropsychology cannot speak, and it's here, beyond the realm of an impersonal psychology, that you may find ways to touch him and change him, and the circumstances of your work especially allow this, for you to work at home, which is like a little world, quite different from the clinics and institutions where I work, neuropsychological. There is little or nothing you can do, but in the realm of the individual, there may be much you can do. Laura mentioned his patient care as manifesting a rare self-awareness, in which hopelessness was mixed with an odd equanimity. I have no memory of the present, Kerr would say. I don't know what I've just done, or where I have just come. I can recall my past very well, but have no memory of my present. When asked whether he had ever seen the person testing him, he said, I can't say yes or no. I can neither affirm nor deny that I have seen you. This was sometimes the case with Jimmy, and like Kerr, who stayed many months in the same hospital, Jimmy began to form a sense of familiarity. He slowly relearned his way around the home, the whereabouts of the dining room, his own room, the elevators, the stairs, and in some sense recognized some of the staff, although he confused them and perhaps had to do so with people from the past. He soon became fond of the nursing sister in the home. He recognized her voice, her footfalls, immediately, but would always say that she had been a fellow pupil at his high school, and was greatly surprised when I addressed her as sister. "Gee!" he exclaimed, "this damnedest thing happened. I'd never had guessed you'd become a religious sister." Since he's been at our home, that is, since early 1975, Jimmy has never been able to identify anyone in constantly. The only person he truly recognizes is his brother, whenever he visits from Oregon. These meetings are deeply emotional and moving to observe, the only truly emotional meetings Jimmy has. He loves his brother, he recognizes him, but he can't understand why he looks so old. Guess some people age fast, he says. Actually, his brother looks much younger than his age, and has the sort of face and build that change a little with the years. These are true meetings, Jimmy's only connection of the past and present, yet they do nothing to provide any sense of history or continuity. If anything, they emphasize, at least to his brother and to others who see them together, that Jimmy still lives, is fossilized in the past. All of us, at first, had high hopes of helping Jimmy. He was so personal, so likable, so quick and intelligent, it was difficult to believe that he might be beyond help. But none of us had ever encountered, even imagined, such power of amnesia, the possibility of a bit into which everything, every experience, every event would fathomlessly drop, a bottomless memory hole that would engulf the whole world. I suggest when I first saw him that he should keep a diary, and be encouraged to keep notes every day of his experience, his feelings, thoughts, memories, reflections. These attempts were foiled, at first, by his continually losing the diary. It had to be attached to him somehow, but this too failed to work. He doubtfully kept a brief daily notebook, but couldn't recognize his earlier 20s in it. He does recognize his own writing and style, and is always astonished to find he wrote something the day before, astonished and indifferent, For he was a man who, in effect, had no day before. His entries remained unconnected and unconnecting, and had no power to provide any sense of time or continuity. Moreover, they were trivial: eggs for breakfast, watched ball game on TV, and never touched the depths. But were there depths in his unmemoried man? Depths of an abiding feeling and thinking? Or had he been reduced to a sort of a human drivel, a mere succession of unrelated impressions and events? Jimmy both was and wasn't aware of this deep, tragic loss of himself if a man has lost a leg or an eye. He knows has lost a leg or an eye, but if he was lost to himself, he can know it, because he's no longer there to know it. Therefore, I couldn't question him intellectually about such matters. He had originally professed bewilderment at finding himself amid patients when, as he said, he himself didn't feel ill, but what, he wondered, did he feel? He was strongly built and fit. He had a sort of animal strength and energy, but also a strange inertia, passivity, and, as everyone remarked, unconcern. He gave all of us an overwhelming sense of something missing, although this, if he realized it, was itself accepted with an odd unconcern. One day I asked him not about his memory or past, but about the simplest and most elemental feeling of all. How do you feel? How do I feel? He repeated and scratched his head. I can say I feel ill, but I can't say I feel well. I can't say I feel anything at all. Are you miserable? I continued. Can't say I am. Do you enjoy life? I can't say I do. I hesitated, fearing that I was going too far, that I might be stripping a man down to some hidden, unacknowledgeable, unbearable despair. You don't enjoy life, I repeated, hesitating somewhat. How then do you feel about life? I can't feel anything at all. You feel alive, though. Feel alive? Not really. I haven't felt alive for a very long time. His face wore a look of infinite sadness and resignation. Later, having noted his aptitude for and pleasure in quick games and puzzles, and their power to hold him, at least while they lasted, and to allow for a while a sense of companionship and competition, he hadn't complained of loneliness, but he looked so alone. He never expressed sadness, but he looked so sad. I suggested he be brought into our recreation program at home. This worked better than the diary. He would become keenly and briefly involved in games, but soon they ceased to offer any challenge. He solved all the puzzles. He could solve them easily, and he was far better and sharper than anyone else at the game. And as he found his out, he grew fretful and stressless again, and wandered the corridors, uneasy and bored with the sense of indignity. Games and puzzles were for children, a diversion. Clearly, passionately, he wanted something to do. He wanted to do, to be, to feel, and couldn't. He wanted sense. He wanted purpose. In Freud's words, work and love. Could he do ordinary work? He had gone to pieces, his brother said. When he ceased to work in 1965, he had two striking skills: Morse code and touch typing. We couldn't use Morse unless we invented a use, but good typing we could use. If he could recover his old skills, and this would be real work, not just a game, Jimmy soon did cover his old skills and came to type very quickly. He couldn't do it slowly, and found in this some of the challenge and satisfaction of a job. But still, this was superficial tabbing and typing. It was trivial, it didn't reach to the depths. And what he typed mechanically. He couldn't hold the thoughts, just short sentences following one another in a meaningless order. One tended to speak of him instinctively as a spiritual casualty, a lost soul. Was it possible that he had really been desouled by the disease? Do you think that he has a soul? I once asked the sisters. They were outraged by my question, but could see why I asked it. Watch Jimmy in chapel, they said, and judge for yourself. I did, and I was moved, profoundly moved and impressed, because I saw here an intense and steadiness of attention and concentration that I had never seen before in him, and conceived him capable of. I watched him kneel and take the sacraments on his tongue, and couldn't doubt the fullness and totality of communion. The perfect alignment of his spirit was the spirit of mass, fully, intensely, quietly, in the quietude of absolute concentration and attention. He entered the birth book of the Holy Communion. He was wholly held, absorbed by a feeling. There was no forgetting, no Korsakov then, nor did it seem possible or imaginable that there should be, or he was no longer at the mercy of faulty or fallible mechanism, that of meaningless sequences and memory traces, but was absorbed in an act of his whole being, which carried feeling and meaning in an organic continuity and unity so seamless it couldn't permit any break. Clearly Jimmy found continuity and reality in the absoluteness of spiritual attention and act. The sisters were right. He did find his soul there. And so was Laura, whose words now came back to me. A man doesn't consist of memory alone, he has feeling, well, sensibility, moral being. It is here you may touch him and see a profound change. Memory, mental activity, mind alone could not hold him, but moral attention and action could hold him completely. But perhaps moral was too narrow a word, for the aesthetic and dramatic were equally involved. Seeing Jem in the chapel opened my eyes to other realms where the soul is called on, and held and stilled in attention and communion. The same depth of absorption and attention was to be seen in relation to music and art. He had no difficulty, I noticed, following music or simple dramas. For every moment in music and art refers to contains other moments. He liked gardening, and had taken over some of the work in our garden. At first he greeted the garden each day as new, but for some reason this had become more familiar to him than the inside of the home. He almost never got lost or disoriented in the garden now. He patterned it, I think, on loved and remembered gardens from his youth in Connecticut. Jimmy, who's so lost in existential spiritual time, was perfectly organized in Bergsonian intentional time. What was fugitive, unsustainable, a formal structure, was perfectly stable, perfectly held, as art or well, moreover, there was something that intruded and survived. If Jimmy was briefly held by task of puzzle or game or calculation, held in the purely mental challenge of these, he would fall apart as soon as they were done, into the abyss of his nothingness, his amnesia. But if he was held in an emotional and spiritual tension, in the contemplation of nature or art, in listening to music, in taking part in a mass in chapel, the attention, its mood, its quietude, would persist for a while, and there would be in him a pensiveness and peace which we rarely, if ever, saw during the rest of his life at the home. I never known Jimmy now for 9 years, and neuropsychologically he hasn't changed in the least. He still has the severest and most devastating Korsakov, cannot remember isolated items for more than a few seconds, and has dense amnesia going back to 1940. 5. But humanly, spiritually, he is at times a different man altogether, no longer fluttering, restless, bored, and lost, but deeply attentive to the beauty and soul of the world, rich in all Kierkegaardian categories and aesthetic, the moral, the religious, the dramatic. I had wondered when I first met him if he was not condemned to a sort of human fourth, a meaningless fluttering on the surface of life, and whether there was any way of transcending the incoherence of his human disease. Empirical science told me there were not, but empirical science, empiricism, takes no account of the soul, no account of what constitutes and determines personal being. Perhaps there is philosophical as well as clinical lesson here, as Korsakov or dementia or other such catastrophes. However great the organic damage and human dissolution, There remains the undiminished possibility of reintegration by art, by communion, by touching the human spirit, and this can be preserved in what seems at first hopeless state of neurological devastation.
Postscript. I know now that retrograde amnesia to some degree is very common, if not universal. In cases of Korsakov's, the classical Korsakov syndrome, a profound and permanent but pure devastating of memory caused by alcoholic destruction of the mammillary body is rare, even among very heavy drinkers. One may of course see Korsakov syndrome with other pathologies, as in Laura's patients with tumors, a particularly fascinating case of an acute and mercifully transient Korsakov syndrome has been well described only very recently in the so-called transient global amnesia, which may occur with migraines, head injuries, or impaired blood supply to the brain. Here, for a few minutes or hours, a severe and singular amnesia may occur even though the patient may continue to drive a car or perhaps to carry on medical or editorial duties in a mechanical way, but under this fluency lies a profound amnesia, very sentence uttered being forgotten as soon as it's said, everything forgotten within a few minutes of being seen, though long-established memories and routine may be perfectly preserved. For a few minutes or hours, a severe and singular amnesia may occur, even though the patient may continue to drive a car or perhaps to carry on medical or editorial duties in a mechanical way, but under this influence lies a profound amnesia, every sentence uttered being forgotten as soon as it's said, everything forgotten within few minutes of being seen. The long-established memories and routines may be perfectly preserved. Some remarkable videotapes of patients during TGA have recently, 1986, been made by Dr. John Hodges of Oxford. Further, there may be a profound retrograde amnesia in such cases. My colleague, Dr. Leon Portas, tells me of a case seen by him recently in which a highly intelligent man was unable for some hours to remember his wife or children, to remember that he had a wife or children. In effect, he lost 30 years of his life. Though fortunately for only a few hours, recovery from such attacks is prompt and complete, yet they are, in a sense, the most horrifying of little strokes in their power absolutely to annual or over decades of richly lived, richly achieving, richly memorable life. The horror typically is only felt by others. The patient, unaware, amnesic for his amnesia, may continue what he's doing, quite unconcerned, and only discover later that he lost not only a day, as is common with ordinary alcoholic blackouts, but half a lifetime, and never knew it. The fact that one can lose the greater part of his life has peculiar, uncanny horror. In adulthood life, higher life, may be brought to a premature end by strokes, senility, brain injuries, etc., but there usually remains a consciousness of life lived, of one's past. There is usually felt as a sort of compensation. At least I lived fully, tasting life to the full before I was brain injured, stricken, etc. This sense of the life lived before, which may be either a consolation or torment, is precisely what is taken away in retrograde amnesia. The final amnesia, the one that could erase an entire life, that Buñuel speaks of, may occur perhaps in a terminal dementia, but not in my experience suddenly in consequences of a stroke. But there is a different, yet comparable sort of amnesia, which can occur suddenly, different in that it's not global but modality specific. Thus, in one patient under my care, a sudden thrombosis in the posterior circulation of the brain caused an immediate death of the visual parts of the brain. Forthwith, this patient became completely blind, but didn't know it. He looked blind, but he made no complaints. Questioning and testing showed, beyond doubt, that not only was he certainly or cortically blind, but he had lost all visual images and memories. Lost them totally, yet had no sense of any loss. Indeed, he had lost the very idea of seeing, and was not only unable to describe anything visually, but bewildered when I used words such as seeing and light. He had become, in a sense, an unvisual being. His entire lifetime of seeing, of visuality, had in effect been stolen. His whole visual life had indeed been erased, and erased permanently in the instant of his stroke. Such a visual amnesia, and so to speak, blindness to the blindness, amnesia for the amnesia, is in effect a total Korsakov, confined to visuality. A still more limited, but none of the less total amnesia may be displayed with regard to a particular form of perception. As in the last chapter, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, there was an absolute prosopagnosia or agnosia for faces. This patient was not unable to recognize faces, but unable to imagine or remember any faces. He had indeed lost the very idea of a face, as many more afflicted patients had lost the very idea of seeing or light. Such syndromes were described by Anton in the 1980s, but the implication of these syndromes, Korsakov and Anton's, what they entail and must entail for the world, their lives, the identities of affected patients, has been scarcely touched on even to this day. In Jimmy's case, we had sometimes wondered how he might respond if taken back to his home town, in effect to his pre-amnesia days. But the little town in Connecticut had become a booming city with the years. Later, I did have occasion to find out what might happen in such circumstances, though this was another patient was Korsakov Stephen R., who had become acutely ill in 1980 and whose retrograde amnesia went back only 2 years or so. With this patient, who also had severe seizures, spasticity, and other problems necessitating inpatient care, rare weekend visits to his home revealed poignant situation. In hospital, he could recognize nobody and nothing, and was in an almost ceaseless frenzy of disorientation. But when his wife took his home to his house, which was in fact a time capsule of his pre-amnesia days, he felt instantly at home. He recognized everything, tapped the barometer, checked the thermometer, took his favorite armchair as he used to do. He spoke of neighbors, shops, the local pub, a nearby cinema, as they had been in the mid-70s. He was distressed and puzzled if the smallest changes were made in the house. "You changed the curtains today?" he once expostulated to his wife. "How come, so suddenly? They were green this morning, but they hadn't been green since 1978. He recognized most of the neighbor houses and shops. They had changed little between 1978 and 1983, but was bewildered by the replacement of the cinema. How could they tear it down and put up a supermarket overnight? He recognized friends and neighbors, but found them oddly older than expected. Old so and so, he's really showing his age. Never noticed it before. How come everyone's showing their age today? But the real poignancy, the horror, would occur when his wife brought him back. Brought him in a fantastic and uncountable manner, so he felt, to a strange home he had never seen, full strangers, and then left him. "What are you doing?" he would scream, terrified and confused. "What in hell is this place? What the hell is going on?" These senses were almost unbearable to watch. We must have seemed like madness or nightmare to the patient. Mercifully, perhaps, he would forget them within a couple of minutes. Such patients, fossilized in the past, can only be at home, oriented in the past. Time for them has come to stop. I hear Stephen R. screaming with terror and confusion when he returns, screaming for a past which no longer exists. But what can we do? Can we create a time capsule, a fiction? Never have I known a patient so confronted, so tormented by anachronism, unless it was the rose hour of awakenings. Jimmy has reached the sort of calm William continually confabulates, but Stephen has a gaping time wound, an agony that will never heal.